It's dawn. On the 15th of March, 1707, and the massive wooden doors of Cape Town's Slave Lodge creak open as the first light touches Table Mountain. Inside, over 600 enslaved people begin another day of systematic dehumanization that the Dutch East India Company has perfected into a science. Among them is Khadija, a young woman from Madagascar, who arrived on a slave ship just 6 months ago. She cradles a newborn infant, not her own child, but one she's been forced to nurse, because the company has determined that lactating women are more valuable than those who aren't. The baby's mother died during childbirth, another casualty of the lodge's brutal breeding program. In the men's quarters, Abdul from Bengal tends to infected wounds on his back, the result of medical experiments conducted by company doctors testing new treatments for tropical diseases. He's not a patient. He's a test subject. His body considered company property to be used as they see fit. What these people are experiencing isn't just slavery. It's something far more systematic, more calculated, and more horrific than most historical accounts have ever revealed. The Cape Town Slave Lodge wasn't just a place where enslaved people lived. It was a laboratory for human exploitation. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. The Cape Town Slave Lodge has been called many things: a dormitory, a labor camp, a symbol of colonial oppression. But the sanitized version of history taught in schools, it barely scratches the surface of what really happened behind those walls. Between 1679 and 1811, the truth is far more disturbing than most people realize. What were the 5 dark truths that Dutch East India Company officials desperately tried to hide from the world? How did the lodge operate? As more than just a place of forced labor, but as a systematic institution of human breeding, sexual exploitation, and medical experimentation? Why were families deliberately torn apart? And how did the company use psychological warfare to destroy the very identities of the people they enslaved? The answers to these questions have been buried in Dutch archives, coded in euphemistic language, and deliberately omitted from historical records for over 300 years. Company officials knew that what they were doing went beyond the already horrific norms of 18th century slavery. They were pioneering of new forms of institutional cruelty that would shock even other slave-holding societies. But the most disturbing truth isn't just what happened inside the slave lodge. It's how successfully these horrors were hidden from history. The deliberate campaign to sanitize, minimize, and erase these truths from historical memory represents one of the most systematic cover-ups in colonial history. Today, we're going to uncover the 5 dark truths that the Dutch East India Company never wanted the world to know. These aren't just historical facts, they're human stories of suffering, survival, and resistance that deserve to be told. This is the untold story of the Cape Town Slave Lodge and why its darkest secrets remained hidden for over 3 centuries. To understand the true horror of what happened at the Cape Town Slave Lodge, we must first understand the world that created it. The year 1652 marked the beginning of permanent Dutch settlement at the Cape of Good Hope. But it was the establishment of the Slave Lodge in 1679 that truly revealed the Dutch East India Company's intentions for this strategic outpost. The company, known as the VOC, was not merely a trading organization, it was a corporate empire, with its own military, legal system, and moral code that prioritized profit above all human considerations. When Jan van Riebeck first established the Cape Colony, the VOC's directors in Amsterdam made it clear this settlement must be self-sustaining and, more importantly, and profitable. The lodge itself was a massive stone structure, built with the labor of the very people it would imprison. Standing 3 stories high and stretching over 200 feet in length, it was designed to house between 600 and 1,000 enslaved people at any given time. But the building's imposing exterior masked its true purpose. It wasn't just accommodation, it was a carefully engineered system of control and exploitation. The enslaved population came from across the Indian Ocean world. Ships arrived regularly from Madagascar, Mozambique, India, Ceylon, and the Indonesian archipelago, their human cargo, destined for the lodge's overcrowded quarters. But unlike plantation slavery in the Americas, the lodge operated under a different and more insidious model. The VOC had studied slavery systems across their empire and determined that the Cape Colony required something more sophisticated. They needed a workforce that could be controlled, bred, and molded to serve the company's long-term interests. The lodge wasn't just a place where enslaved people lived between work shifts. It was a laboratory for human engineering. Company records from 1707 reveal the cold calculation behind the lodge's operations. Directors wrote to Amsterdam describing their human livestock with the same clinical detachment they used for discussing cattle or grain shipments. They had quotas and for births, mortality rates they considered acceptable, and detailed records of which ethnic groups produced the most compliant workers. The lodge operated under what the company called the accommodation system, a euphemism that masked the reality of total institutional control. Every aspect of life was regulated, from sleeping arrangements to meals, from work assignments to reproductive relationships. The company had learned that controlling people's most intimate relationships was the key to breaking their spirits and ensuring compliance. By 1707, the lodge had been operating for nearly 3 decades, and the company had refined its methods to a terrifying degree of efficiency. They had created a system that went beyond mere labor exploitation. It was a comprehensive program of human destruction and reconstruction, designed to create a permanent class of subjugated people who would serve the company's interests for generations. They called it the Slave Lodge, but behind its stone walls lay a darker reality. What you're about to hear is the first of 5 dark truths that reveal what the Dutch East India Company never wanted the world to know. Dark truth number 1. The first and perhaps most shocking truth about the Cape Town Slave Lodge is that it operated as a systematic human breeding facility. Company documents from 1707 reveal that the VOC had implemented what they called the Population Enhancement Program, a clinical term for forced reproduction, designed to create a self-sustaining workforce. The program began in earnest around 1695, when company officials realized that importing enslaved people was becoming increasingly expensive and risky. Pirates, disease, and slave revolts on ships had created supply problems that threatened the colony's labor force. The solution, according to a confidential company memo dated 1703, was to breed our own stock. At the lodge, women of childbearing age were separated into special quarters and subjected to medical examinations to determine their fertility. Those deemed most suitable for reproduction were assigned to what the company euphemistically called family units, forced partnerships with men selected for their physical strength and perceived genetic traits. The horror of this system becomes clear in the personal account of Maria, a woman from Mozambique, whose story survived in a secret journal kept by a Dutch clerk who later fled the colony in disgust. Maria was paired with 3 different men over a period of 5 years, each time after her previous partner died from overwork or disease. When she failed to conceive after 2 years, she was subjected to brutal medical procedures designed to correct her deficiency. The company tracked pregnancies with the same meticulous record-keeping they applied to livestock. They maintained detailed charts showing conception rates, birth survival rates, and what they called breeding efficiency by ethnic group. A surviving ledger from 1707 shows that Malagasy women had the highest survival rates during childbirth, while children of mixed Indonesian African parentage were considered most suitable for skilled labor positions. But the breeding program's cruelty extended far beyond forced partnerships. Pregnant women were kept in separate quarters and subjected to experimental diets designed to improve birth outcomes. Company doctors, many of whom had no formal medical training, conducted procedures on pregnant women that would be considered torture by any standard. The most disturbing aspect of the breeding program was its psychological warfare component. The company deliberately created confusion about family relationships, often separating children from their mothers immediately after birth and redistributing them to different wet nurses. This prevented the formation of strong family bonds that might lead to resistance or escape attempts. Children born in the lodge were considered company property from birth, with their future roles predetermined by company officials. Boys deemed physically strong were designated for manual labor. Those showing intelligence were selected for skilled trades. Girls were evaluated for domestic service, or most horrifically, for future inclusion in the breeding program. The program's success can be measured in the company's own statistics. By 1707, nearly 40% of the lodge's population had been born in captivity, creating a generation of people who knew no other life than company servitude. This was precisely what the VOC intended: a workforce that would accept their condition as natural and inevitable. Dark truth number 2. The second dark truth that reveals the lodge's systematic sexual exploitation, which went far beyond the forced breeding program. Company records describe what they called recreational privileges, a system that allowed Dutch officials and visiting sailors to sexually abuse enslaved women with complete impunity. The exploitation was institutionalized through what the company termed temporary companionship arrangements. Women were assigned to Dutch officials as personal servants, but these arrangements were understood by everyone involved to include sexual services. The company maintained detailed records of these assignments, treating them as just another form of labor allocation. A secret report from 1706, discovered in the VOC archives in the 1990s, describes the entertainment quarters, special rooms in the lodge, where Dutch officials could take enslaved women. The report, written by a company inspector, matter-of-factly discusses the quality of different women and recommends improvements to the system's efficiency. The testimony of Fatima, a woman from Java, provides a harrowing glimpse into this system. Her account, preserved in a Dutch missionary's private letters, describes being selected at age 16 for service in the entertainment quarters. She was subjected to regular medical examinations to prevent disease transmission to Dutch clients, while her own health and well-being were completely ignored. The sexual exploitation extended to the lodge's administration. Company officials received enslaved women as part of their compensation packages, along with food rations and housing. These women were expected to provide domestic services, sexual services, and bear children, who would increase the officials' personal wealth through ownership of additional slaves. The system was so normalized that company correspondence discusses it in routine business terms. A letter from the Cape Governor to Amsterdam in 1707 requests additional female stock for distribution to new officials describing human beings, with the same language used for ordering furniture or livestock. Women who became pregnant through these arrangements faced particularly cruel treatment. If they bore children to Dutch fathers, these children occupied a liminal space in the colony's racial hierarchy, not fully enslaved, but never free. Many were sent away from the colony to prevent complications in the racial classification system that the company depended upon for social control. The psychological impact of this systematic sexual violence cannot be overstated. Women lived in constant fear of selection for the entertainment quarters, while men in the lodge were forced to witness the abuse of their partners, sisters, and daughters without any power to intervene. This created a climate of terror that served the company's interests. By preventing organized resistance, the company's own medical records reveal the extent of the trauma. Reports describe high rates of what they called melancholia among enslaved women, a condition that modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Rather than addressing the causes of this suffering, company doctors prescribed increased labor as a cure for mental distress. Dark truth number 3. The third dark truth exposes the lodge's systematic campaign to destroy family bonds and cultural identity among enslaved people. The company had studied successful slave societies across their empire and determined that maintaining connections to family and culture was the primary source of resistance and escape attempts. The separation process began immediately upon arrival. Families who had managed to stay together during the horrific Middle Passage were deliberately split up during the lodge's registration process. Parents were assigned to different work gangs. Children were removed from their mothers, and siblings were placed in separate quarters. This wasn't accidental, it was company policy, designed to prevent the formation of mutual support networks. The lodge's architecture itself served this purpose. The building was designed with numerous separate quarters that could be sealed off from each other, preventing communication between different groups of enslaved people. Guards patrolled constantly, and anyone caught trying to communicate with family members in other quarters faced severe punishment. Language destruction was another key component of the identity erasure program. The company banned the use of native languages within the lodge, imposing what they called Dutch-only policies. Guards were instructed to punish anyone overheard speaking Malagasy, Arabic, Portuguese, or any of the dozens of other languages represented in the lodge's population. The testimony of Ahmad, an Islamic scholar from India, reveals the spiritual dimensions of this cultural destruction. His account, hidden in the margins of a Quran that survived from the lodge, describes how the company systematically prevented religious practices. Islamic prayer was banned, traditional burial rites were forbidden, and religious texts were confiscated and burned. Children born in the lodge were given Dutch names and deliberately kept ignorant of their parents' cultural backgrounds. The company created what they called cultural orphans, people who knew nothing of their heritage and had no identity beyond their service to the company. This was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. The separation of families had devastating psychological effects that the company actively exploited. Parents who had lost children became more compliant workers, desperate to avoid additional punishment that might prevent them from ever seeing their children again. Children who had been separated from their parents were easier to control and manipulate. The company's records reveal the calculated nature of these separations. They maintained detailed charts showing which family configurations were most likely to produce resistance, and they used this information to guide their separation policies. Families with strong patriarchal structures were split first, while mother-child bonds were severed through strategic work assignments. The lodge's name system was another tool of identity destruction. Upon arrival, Enslaved people were given simple Dutch names that bore no resemblance to their original identities. These names were often deliberately humiliating. Grown men were given children's names, while women were named after household objects or animals. The company also manipulated religious identity as a form of control. They forced conversion to Christianity, while simultaneously preventing genuine religious practice. The lodge's chapel was used for mandatory services that served more as loyalty tests than spiritual gatherings. Enslaved people were required to recite Dutch prayers and sing hymns, praising the company's divine authority. Dark truth number 4. The fourth dark truth reveals perhaps the most horrific aspect of the lodge's operations: the systematic medical experimentation on enslaved people. Company doctors used the lodge's population as test subjects for new treatments, surgical procedures, and pharmaceutical compounds, treating human beings as laboratory animals. The experiments began in earnest around 1700, when the company established what they called the Medical Research Division at the lodge. This division was tasked with developing treatments for tropical diseases that affected Dutch colonists. But they had no interest in treating the enslaved people themselves. They were merely convenient test subjects. Dr. Willem Hendricks, the company's chief medical officer from 1705 to 1712, left detailed records of his experiments in a private journal discovered in Dutch archives. His notes describe procedures that would violate every principle of medical ethics. He infected healthy enslaved people with diseases to test potential cures, performed surgeries without anesthesia to study human anatomy, and tested experimental drugs with no regard for his subjects' survival. The malaria experiments were particularly brutal. Hendricks deliberately infected groups of enslaved people with different strains of malaria, then tested various treatments to determine which were most effective. His notes coldly record survival rates and symptoms, treating human suffering as data points. In his research, surgical experiments were conducted with equal callousness. The company's doctors performed unnecessary operations to practice new techniques, often resulting in death or permanent disability. They justified these procedures as medical training necessary for treating Dutch colonists. But the reality was that they were using enslaved people as disposable practice subjects. The obstetric experiments were among the most horrific. Company doctors performed experimental procedures on pregnant enslaved women, testing new delivery techniques, and studying the effects of various drugs on pregnancy outcomes. Many women died during these procedures, but the company considered this an acceptable cost for advancing medical knowledge. The lodge's medical quarters were specifically designed for these experiments. They included primitive operating rooms, isolation cells for infectious disease studies, and what the company called observation chambers, rooms where enslaved people were kept under constant surveillance. While doctors studied the progression of diseases they had deliberately induced, the psychological experiments were equally disturbing. Company doctors studied the effects of various forms of psychological torture, documenting how different types of trauma affected work performance and compliance. They experimented with sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, and what they called social isolation protocols, systematic methods of breaking people's spirits. The medical records reveal the company's complete dehumanization of enslaved people. They referred to their test subjects using the same terminology they applied to laboratory animals, describing them as specimens, subjects, and materials. Individual human beings were reduced to case numbers in experimental protocols. The company's doctors also conducted what they called racial studies, pseudo-scientific research, designed to support theories about the supposed biological inferiority of different ethnic groups. They measured skull sizes, documented skin color variations, and studied what they claimed were racial differences in intelligence and physical capability. These experiments served multiple purposes for the company. They provided medical knowledge that could be used to treat Dutch colonists. They generated data that could be used to justify the enslavement of different populations. And they created an atmosphere of terror that helped maintain control over the lodge's population. Dark truth number 5. The fifth and final dark truth reveals the systematic campaign to hide these atrocities from history. The Dutch East India Company understood that their actions at the lodge went beyond the accepted norms of even 18th century slavery, and they implemented a comprehensive cover-up that lasted for centuries. The cover-up began with the company's record-keeping system. While they maintained detailed internal records of their activities, they created separate official records that presented a sanitized version of the lodge's operations. These official records described the lodge as a worker accommodation facility and made no mention of the breeding programs, to medical experiments, or systematic sexual exploitation. Company officials were required to take oaths of secrecy regarding the lodge's true operations. A surviving copy of this oath, discovered in the 1980s, bound officials to maintain absolute discretion regarding the special programs and procedures implemented at the lodge. Violation of this oath was punishable by death. The company also engaged in what modern historians call documentary genocide, the systematic destruction of evidence. When officials left the colony, they were required to destroy their personal records related to the lodge. Company correspondence from 1710 includes explicit instructions for purging sensitive materials from official archives. The cover-up extended to the physical evidence. When the lodge was finally closed in 1811, the company ordered the destruction of the medical quarters, breeding facilities, and entertainment quarters. They wanted to eliminate any physical evidence that might reveal the true nature of what had happened there. The linguistic cover-up was equally comprehensive. Company officials developed an elaborate system of euphemisms to describe their activities in official correspondence. Forced breeding became population enhancement. Sexual exploitation became recreational privileges, and medical experiments became health improvement programs. The company also controlled the narrative through their influence over early historians and travel writers. They provided funding and access to scholars who wrote favorable accounts of the colony, while blocking access to anyone who might expose the truth. Early histories of the Cape Colony contain glowing descriptions of the lodge as a model of enlightened slave management. The religious cover-up was particularly insidious. The company worked closely with Dutch Reformed Church officials to create a theological justification for their actions. They developed elaborate religious arguments that portrayed the enslaved people as benefiting from their forced conversion to Christianity, while ignoring the systematic abuse that accompanied this conversion. The company's influence extended far beyond the colonial period. When the British took control of the Cape in 1795, they inherited the Dutch administrative system and continued to suppress information about the lodge's true operations. British officials found it convenient to maintain the fiction that they had inherited a relatively benign form of slavery. The academic cover-up continued well into the 20th century. Mainstream historians working from the sanitized official records presented accounts of Cape slavery that bore little resemblance to the reality of the lodge's operations. It wasn't until the 1990s that scholars gained access to the private archives and personal records that revealed the full scope of the atrocities. The cover-up was so successful that even today, many standard histories of South Africa barely mention the lodge's true operations. The systematic breeding programs, medical experiments, and deliberate family separations remain largely unknown to the general public. despite clear documentary evidence of their existence. The impact of the Cape Town Slave Lodge extended far beyond its walls and far beyond the colonial period. The systematic dehumanization, family destruction, and identity erasure practiced at the lodge created trauma that reverberated through generations and established patterns of racial oppression that would define South African society for centuries. The lodge's breeding programs created a large population of people who had been born into slavery and knew no other life. By 1811, when the lodge was finally closed, thousands of people traced their ancestry to the forced reproduction programs implemented there. These individuals formed the core of what would become the Cape's colored population, a group that would face centuries of marginalization and discrimination. The psychological impact of the lodge's operations cannot be overstated. The systematic separation of families, destruction of cultural identity, and constant threat of violence created what modern psychologists would recognize as intergenerational trauma. Children born in the lodge grew up with no knowledge of their cultural heritage, no strong family bonds, and no sense of identity beyond their service to white authority. The lodge's influence on South African society extended far beyond the enslaved population. The attitudes and practices developed there became the foundation for the racial hierarchies that would define the country for centuries. The pseudo-scientific racial theories tested at the lodge provided intellectual justification for later apartheid policies. The economic impact was equally significant. The lodge's operations generated enormous wealth for the Dutch East India Company and established Cape Town as a major commercial center. The forced labor provided by the lodge's population built the infrastructure that would make the Cape Colony profitable for centuries. But this wealth was built on systematic human exploitation that left entire communities impoverished and marginalized. The lodge's medical experiments contributed to the development of European tropical medicine, but at a horrific human cost. The knowledge gained from these experiments was used to protect European colonists across Africa, while enslaved and indigenous populations continued to suffer from preventable diseases. The lodge's doctors published papers based on their research, without ever acknowledging that their data came from experiments on unwilling human subjects. The cultural impact of the lodge's identity destruction programs lasted for generations. Entire cultural traditions, languages, and religious practices were lost as a result of the systematic suppression implemented there. The lodge's name system alone resulted in the permanent loss of thousands of individual and family names, severing connections to ancestral cultures that could never be restored. The lodge's influence on gender relations was particularly devastating. The systematic sexual exploitation practiced there established patterns of gender-based violence that continued long after abolition. Women who had been enslaved at the lodge faced a lifetime of trauma, while their children grew up in a society that normalized sexual violence against people of color. The lodge's operations also established precedents for institutional racism that would influence South African law and policy for centuries. The legal frameworks developed to manage the lodge's population became the foundation for later passed laws of residential segregation and other apartheid policies. The Cape Town Slave Lodge represents one of the most systematic and comprehensive programs of human exploitation in recorded history. The 5 dark truths we have uncovered today: the forced breeding programs, systematic sexual exploitation, deliberate family separation, medical experimentation, and historical cover-up, reveal the extraordinary lengths to which the Dutch East India Company went to maximize their profits from human suffering. But perhaps the most important truth of all is that these atrocities were not the result of individual cruelty or historical accident. They were the product of a carefully designed system, a system that treated human beings as nothing more than economic resources to be exploited, bred, and disposed of, according to commercial interests. The Lodge's story matters, not just as historical fact, but as a reminder of humanity's capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and remarkable resilience. The people who survived the Lodge's horrors, who maintained their humanity despite systematic dehumanization, and who passed down their stories, despite centuries of suppression, represent the triumph of human dignity over institutional evil. The systematic cover-up that followed the Lodge's closure reminds us that the powerful will always try to hide their crimes from history. It is only through persistent investigation, brave scholarship, and the courage of survivors and their descendants that the truth finally emerges today as we face new forms of systematic oppression and institutional violence. Around the world, the story of the Cape Town Slave Lodge serves as both a warning and a call to action. We must remain vigilant against the forces that would reduce human beings to mere economic units, and we must never allow the powerful to erase the stories of those they have exploited. The 5 dark truths of the Cape Town Slave Lodge are not just historical facts, they are human stories that demand our attention, our respect, and our commitment to ensuring that such systematic dehumanization never happens again. The people who suffered behind those walls deserve to be remembered, and their stories deserve to be told. This is the Missing History Records, and these are the truths that were hidden for over 300 years